Welcome to Headliners Forum. We're here to bring you the best in Texas journalism, the stories behind the great stories. I'm Mark Morrison. Our special guest is Erin Sheridan of the Brownsville Herald, who won the Charles Green Award for Outstanding Reporter of the Year. Her coverage of courts, crime, immigration, and other news while navigating the challenges of COVID-19 beat out entries from scores of other Texas media, many of them bigger outlets. Her work was judged by the Headliners Foundation and the Texas AP Managing Editors Association. Erin, congratulations on your excellent journalism, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you for the award. Definitely not something I ever expected, and I'm happy to be here representing all of my hardworking colleagues at the Brownsville Herald who do this every day.
It has been a challenging time. Let's start with some of your coverage of the farmers down that way dealing with constraints of COVID-19, and they ended up having an invasion of Mexican fruit fly about the same time, and so farming became a real difficult business to be in, and you chronicled it well.
Thank you. Well, we published a story called Invisible Enemy, which was a quote from one of the farmers who I interviewed talking about the coronavirus, and he was a citrus farmer. So the story I wrote at the pandemic's onset about citrus farming, I believe in April of 2020, they were struggling with a citrus quarantine, and that was something that had been brought to my attention for the first time during the lockdown in Brownsville. This went on only for a few weeks, and as I'm sure you remember, nobody really knew what was going on or exactly how to be safe. And in the Rio Grande Valley, the grocery stores emptied quickly, and the local supply chain for small farmers had been broken. So as the weeks went on, the markets still weren't in operation, and this was strangling the income of local farmers. And there was a group called the Brownsville Wellness Coalition that was and still is working to put together produce bundle bags that they would then sell weekly through a drive-through or deliver to people to keep income moving to farmers in the area, and also to make sure that people had access to fresh food. So the Rio Grande Valley is historically one of the nation's breadbaskets, and we hadn't really covered this. And so I wanted to get a sense of how COVID was affecting the people that feed us every day. I was put in touch with the Martinez family, who operated a business called Laura's Grapefruit and grew on land out in Bayview. And I realized in speaking to them that citrus farmers had taken multiple hits from this confluence of factors adversely impacting grows in the area. Not only had the markets where their customer base was closed, but there was the citrus quarantine that you mentioned implemented by the USDA due to Mexican fruit fly infestations that had in February of 2020 forced them to bury most of their fruit 10 feet underground. There was also drought that year. And so they told me that they had maybe 10 to 20% of their fruit to harvest and to juice. And they also worried on top of that that they would have to replant many trees due to the pest infestations. So then I realized that on top of that, the lockdown also meant a shortage of farm workers. I think it's always really important to weave in these small details that might not get picked up in your average news blurb into this local coverage. I had discussed with Lupe, which is a local workers union, about the farm workers, many of whom are undocumented, being afraid to get into their cars to drive to farms during lockdown, because in Texas, it's also illegal to have a driver's license if you're undocumented. Which led me into other stories as well, because through that, I learned that some jurisdictions in the counties had policies where they would issue traffic tickets instead of sending people to jail, where those people would then likely be placed on ICE holds and transferred into federal custody and into deportation proceedings. And that didn't happen everywhere because some of the officers in the community understood this transitory nature of our area, and also the need to practice something of humility, which I think was really interesting. But that citrus story also opened up stories about a local push to teach people how to grow their own food and harness the multiple growing seasons that happen in the Rio Grande Valley, and also to create fresh local produce markets, which aims to fix a hole in the supply chain in an area where there are quite a few food deserts.
Right.
Yeah.
Another of your major pieces was about the so-called tent court system
Yeah.
that was set up during the Trump administration. And there was little known about these courts. They were off limits by the administration to the press and other outside observers for quite a while. You managed to get inside, and it was a fascinating story what you found there.
Yeah, so bear with me for a second because there's some background to the story that I want to put into perspective. I arrived in Texas in October 2019. The day after I arrived in Texas, I crossed into Matamoros to see the refugee camp across the border that had formed under the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico program called the Migrant Protection Protocols, which here I will refer to as MPP. So at that point, the camp was swelling to maybe 2,000 people. And over the course of the next few months, the camp grew to 3,000, with thousands more living in shelters and apartments throughout Matamoros awaiting their asylum hearings. And this, at the time, from what I understand, was one of the largest camps along the US-Mexico border. The conditions in the plaza by the International Bridge and the proximity to US-based aid, which in Brownsville was driven by some highly organized and very impressive local communities on the US side, that made it possible for this camp to remain in place despite ongoing threats to either demolish it or relocate people to shelters by Mexican authorities who didn't really want who appear to not have wanted the migration problem visible. So the tent courts had opened about, I think in September 2019, maybe, or had been announced maybe a month prior to my arrival. So keep in mind, people in the camp under MPP had legally claimed asylum and were found to have credible fear after being interviewed, detained, and processed by Customs and Border Protection at legal ports of entry. But in the summer of 2018, the Trump administration had implemented a policy called metering, where CBP officers barred people without US passports or visas from crossing the international line by placing officers there. So these people were in removal proceedings in federal immigration courts and considered to be in detained status while they were simultaneously living homeless on the streets of northern Mexico, which, according to our own State Department, is one of the most dangerous regions in the world. I think even today, the state of Tamaulipas has like a level 4 travel warning, which is the same given to Afghanistan. So come to find out, there were also people in the camp who had crossed into the United States and had been apprehended within a certain zone on the border that qualified them for a classification called entry without inspection. And under normal circumstances, that would have had people either paroled to family members or placed in a detention center for the duration of their asylum proceedings. And while the detention centers have their own problems, there you would have the ability to stave off deportation and ask for a bond hearing, appeal your case and have a bed to sleep in versus being worried about getting kidnapped, assaulted, or worse every night in a tent next to the river. And you know, this is important. The thing about the border is that humanitarian crises become normalized because they are so frequent, and you stop seeing it after a while. And I would watch families suffer in tents not 50 feet across the river from the local community college, which is right down the street from where the tent courts were set up. And so I wanted to counter that normalization by getting these stories into the local news in a way that they were not prior to this. So the tent courts were on everybody's mind because no journalists from any outlet were allowed in. So naturally, I was interested in getting inside. And I couldn't. And so I did the same thing that I had done elsewhere, which is that I sought out attorneys and organizers, because these are the people who are on the ground collecting stories and details. These are the people who hear and see what's actually going on. And then they're also the ones who are willing to talk about it because they tend to have, I think, a sense of responsibility to the collective and also the drive to do something about it. So I had been doing research in the months leading up to the story on the tent courts, which we did in February 2020 when they were finally open to the public. I would walk into the camp with friends who could help me translate and ask how the cases were going. And then I would also find days when asylum cases were being heard in the permanent immigration court building in Harlingen, like 30 minutes north of Brownsville, to get a sense of what the proceedings might be like. So at this point, cases being heard in that building were cases where people had either entered prior to Remain in Mexico or had been properly classified as entry without inspection, and then paroled from detention centers or Customs and Border Protection custody and then showing up for their asylum hearings. The courts wouldn't make those asylum dockets public, so I had to show up, ask, say I was a citizen observer, and hope someone would give me the correct information. And I learned a lot there just by watching. I remember at one point I watched a woman and her young son sit there as the translator, who was remote and not visible. Their face wasn't visible. It was over a speaker, speaking in the wrong language. And it sounded like it was supposed to be a Mayan language, which is something that we know now. This happens frequently in US immigration courts, where the native language translators are costly. They are for profit. They're not always available. And so people sit through their proceedings not knowing what's going on. So I figured that if this was happening here, then the conditions in the tent courts, where the government was arguably purposely hiding asylum cases behind closed doors and prolonging them, presumably as a deterrent strategy, had to be similar or worse. So come January and early February 2020, there was enough activism and pressure, both locally and nationally, to put on the Department of Homeland Security to incentivize them to open the courts up for public view. So there had been a congressional delegation that visited the camp and got a tour of the facilities. And afterwards, I jumped on that opportunity. And I mean, we were right there. I could get approval from a press contact the day before a hearing. I could walk half a mile from my apartment and get cleared to go inside and then watch the proceedings before anyone else had the chance. So we had been hearing rumors of misconduct for months, judges not even reading through the evidence, and we wanted to see it. They unfortunately would not let us watch the merits hearings, which is where most of the evidence in asylum cases is reviewed. And they took our IDs. They wouldn't let us bring anything other than a notepad and writing utensils, which is standard in any federally operated court. But what I thought was interesting about this is that the people working inside were contracted by a private company, which I had not seen before. So my editor attended one of 2 times that I went in and drew what at the time was probably the only image from inside the tent court system available to the public. And what I found inside was just this, what I would describe as a relentlessly monotonous bureaucracy. And it was juxtaposed with people who were often sick. I remember during one visit, there was a young girl in her father's arms in front of me who was so ill she could barely open her eyes or sit up. You had people desperately telling the judge that they're homeless in Mexico. The judge would then extend cases. They'd reset hearing dates weeks or months down the road. If someone didn't have the correct paperwork, or if their attorney didn't show up via the remote connection, because these judges were not present in the courtroom, they were on screens. The hearings would be extended longer, and then people would have to go back to their tents. These people were obviously in crisis and expressed that they didn't feel like they had time to wait. I don't think that we can imagine the effect that sitting in a tent for years or months at a time with your children through all kinds of weather, without the ability to go home, to work, to go to school, to participate in normal social activities has on your mental and physical health. And it was quite honestly horrifying to witness as a reporter. But the process that I used there to get inside has always been my process. You go where the people are and you learn about how the system does or does not serve them. And I think there's truth to be found in any situation, and in stories like this where there's such an incredible imbalance of power, that's where we as journalists are most needed. So you find ways in where the system won't let you, and you continue to do so. And those small details that you pick up in the process of trying to find a way in have immeasurable value. And to include those in local news stories was a gift, or to be able to. And I'll say, I read a quote recently that it goes something like, the systems that we have are perfectly designed to get the results that they do. And in my observation, that is what was happening there. So I'm glad that we got to document it.
As the judges in this contest said, Erin consistently demonstrates a propensity to take on poignant, timely, moving subjects. Thank you for sharing how you pursued these difficult stories. You can read Erin Sheridan's award-winning stories and view interviews with other award-winning Texas journalists on our site, headlinersfoundation.org. For Gary Pickle, producer of Headliners Forum, I'm Mark Morrison.